Hi, Linda. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to do a quick introduction of myself and a little bit about Northwest Veg, and then a little bit about the meal that we're going to be making. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to just shout them out, or you can also type them out. I'll be checking the box as I go. So my name is Danielle, and I am the Outreach and Volunteer Coordinator for Northwest Veg. And I would describe Northwest Veg as an organization that creates pop-up spaces and situations where we celebrate veganism and just veg-friendly living in general. And I like that phrasing because it's so encompassing. The road to living a veg-friendly life has a lot of different paths. Some folks come here because they feel very strongly about animal welfare. Some folks end up on this road because they feel very strongly about trying to eat more whole foods or a plant-based lifestyle. Other folks are here because of their religious beliefs or even because of environmental concerns. So there are a lot of different reasons why people are dedicated to living a more veg-focused life. And Northwest Veg is determined to create a space where people can ask questions, they can feel safe, they can work on recipes, they can work on different lifestyle concepts and not feel like you have to be a salty old veteran vegetarian or vegan to gain the benefit from having a more veg-friendly lifestyle. So like I said before, my name's Danielle. I used to run a vegan and gluten-free kitchen for several years. I did catering for roller derby officials throughout Canada and the United States for several years. So doing a cooking demo is a really, really fun way for me to be able to still stay connected to the community during these times where we're all staying separate. And I am going to be doing a cooking demo for Ashwin's meal today. And Ashwin, can you remind me, can you tell me what the name of this dish is?
It's originally called Palak Paneer in India. So Palak basically means spinach and paneer is cottage cheese. That's what it's called here. So being vegan, avoiding animal product, I replaced the cottage cheese with tofu. And so it's now called Palak Tofu.
I love it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but when folks who are doing Indian cooking are talking about cottage cheese, they're not talking about what Americans might be thinking of. Right? So we're not talking about like that gloopy stuff that comes in a tub. Mm-hmm. It's bigger curds than that.
Correct,
right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not the exact same thing, but pretty close, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted for folks who are thinking like, oh, I'm going to be replacing cottage cheese in this to not be surprised that we don't have spoonfuls of gloopy American style cottage cheese in this. Thank you, Ashwin. So this is a meal that I know that Ashwin likes to make on a regular basis. And when I made it last week, I was really, really happy to see how easy it comes together, how well it saves, and then also just it's a very good plant-based whole foods meal. And for these cold winter nights that are coming up, like it's a really good hearty dish. So I really appreciate Ashwin sharing this meal. And as I was looking into it, since we are doing this for sustainability, I was taking the time to kind of dive into a little bit about this recipe. And we want to be creating a meal that's doing the least damage and ideally having the smallest footprint. And for folks who have done that deep dive and gone down into that rabbit hole before, you're probably very familiar with how complicated of a quest that is, because there's a lot of different aspects to look at. So when I was just trying to Google what are the best foods for being eco-friendly or earth-friendly, every list had something different. And it's because we could be talking about land use. You know, for instance, lentils are great at not using a lot of water. They're great at not having a big carbon footprint, but they take a lot of land to produce that pound of lentils or other kinds of legumes. So that would be a totally different list than if we're talking about water use, which tomatoes do great. Tomatoes and potatoes do great on both land use and water use. But So it can be difficult to try to figure out if you've ever watched the TV show The Good Place. It's kind of a complicated question to try to figure out how you can make a meal that has the least impact. But there are some tips that you can put into practice. And the first one is always focus on locally grown. We're lucky in the Pacific Northwest because we kind of live in a cornucopia of amazing foods that can be locally grown. I grew up originally in the Midwest in Kansas, where our most of our exports are cattle and wheat and a little bit of corn. But I didn't know that strawberries weren't white in the center and crunchy and tart until I moved to the Pacific Northwest, because we don't grow strawberries in Kansas the same way. We don't have the same perfect weather for it. And I had never seen blackberry vines until I moved to the Pacific Northwest. And then I thought it was very quaint, but that was before I learned that it was an invasive species that was going to take over my backyard if I didn't keep an eye on it. So we're very, very lucky that in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of different resources can be locally grown. A good rule of thumb to keep in mind is, in a perfect world, you would go for organic if that's possible, because that does usually mean that less synthetic pesticides and fungicides were put on it. However, if you're choosing between something that's organic but was shipped in maybe from Mexico or New Zealand, and something that's not organic and came a little bit closer, maybe is from California or other parts, or maybe greenhouse here in the Pacific Northwest, it's better to choose something that you hopefully are able to identify as more local. So that's why it's a great idea when you get a chance to shop at your farmers markets, because usually you're getting something that's going to be having traveled a lot less miles to get to you. So that's a great rule of thumb. The other thing that I was reading about is in this meal, I'll tell you a little bit about the ingredients that we're going to be putting in this meal. First of all, I'll show you. So I made this, like I said, ahead of time. This is the meal that we're going to be making, and you can put it, you can top it with rice, or put rice on top, or put it on top of rice, or barley. Barley is a really, really good small footprint grain. Rice can be a little tricky depending on what your qualifiers are, but barley is great, and it's also a really good hearty grain. So we've got, this is some of the tofu here. I'll hold this up to the camera. That's a big old chunk of tofu. I've got my potato in here. I went a little overboard on the chilies on this dish, so I'm gonna hold back a little bit more on this one, and then I'm gonna mix these together and hopefully balance that out. But you can see it's like a good, thick, hearty meal. So the ingredients that we're gonna be using for today is spinach, tomato, onion, garlic, ginger, and our oil, and then potato and tofu. So a lot of those ingredients are things that we can find locally in our area. Spinach grows so super easily. It's a pretty low maintenance crop. Potatoes are actually a really, really good crop for small footprints. They produce a lot of natural pesticides and fungicides, so you don't have to use as many synthetic chemicals on them. They're water efficient. It only takes 50 gallons per pound to produce potatoes. And they're really long lasting. You can forget about a potato for quite a long time, and then you can still make something do with it. So they're great for minimizing food waste. And then tomatoes, the Pacific Northwest just rocks with producing great tomatoes. We have a lot of different varieties. And they have really deep roots. So they use a lot of water that are way, way deeper. So you don't have to water them as much in the summer when things are getting hot. And then, onions as well. If you're somebody who has the right kind of soil setup for onions, you can grow onions here. So I think that this is going to be a really good meal for somebody who is wanting to make something that is filling, that is hearty, that is plant-based. It's pretty healthy, it's flavorful, but it also has a really reasonably small impact, both in land use and also water consumption and things like that. A lot of the ingredients that we're using are not going to have a huge off the charts thing. The other thing I would like to mention is studies show over and over again, if you're worried about your environmental impact with your meal, obviously going vegan or vegetarian or minimizing your meat and dairy products is by far, time and time again, even if you use something that is the worst vegetable or the worst fruit, it usually is still making a better impact than using the most conscientious meat sources or dairy sources. So we're already on the right track by not having meat or cheese in this. And then we're just going to take it to the next level by making sure that we're using organic and locally grown when possible. So the first step of what I'm going to go ahead and do is we're using 1.5 onions, and I'll take actually, Ashwin, if you have a chance, if you can share a link to the recipe in the chat, great. If you don't have the time to, don't worry, I'll do that at the end of this. But so I've taken 1 onion here, and the recipe calls for 1.5 onions. So I've taken 1. You can chop it pretty big. I didn't even really bother to separate it too much because this is going to go into the blender or the food processor later. So we don't have to worry about making this super even. You obviously don't want to have huge chunks and then small chunks because otherwise it's not going to cook evenly. But so I've got onion, and I'm going to take the onion and toss it in my skillet. My skillet's going to be at medium low, depending on how touchy of a stovetop you've got. So I'm going to put about a tablespoon of oil in the skillet. And then one other thing that I really like about this recipe is it's great for using some of your produce that might be at the end of its life, because you are making that sauce with so much of the ingredients. So I used, it said to call for 1 tomato, and my local tomato options were these little cherry tomatoes, which I've been meaning to getting around to eat, and I haven't. And now, as you can see, like, they're kind of, he's a little pruny. This guy's not living his best life anymore. He's kind of at the end of his life. So this is great for using this because it's going to go into the blender. It's making its sauce. I don't have to worry about having the plumpest, juiciest tomatoes for my salad or anything like that. So we're going to add that into the mix as well. We're also going to do ginger. So this is, it's going to call for a tablespoon of ginger. Now I went ahead and got a whole ginger root. I make a lot of chai anyways, so I wanted to have whole ginger, but also another good reference rule if you're trying to figure out a tip for minimizing your footprint is the less processed it is, it means that the less resources went into making it. So while I certainly could go get some crushed ginger in a jar, that crushed ginger had to be sent to a manufacturing place, had to be processed, had to be jarred. Usually it has additives like xanthan gum and other things put in there. And then it has to be refrigerated and has to be shipped out. So that's using a lot of resources. So I went ahead and just got the whole ginger, and let me find my mortar here. So I'm going to go ahead and crush it here with my mortar and pestle. I'm going to skin it first. So you just have to just chop off the edges here in the skin. And again, we don't have to be too worried about if we get this crushed just right, because it's going in the blender anyways. But I wouldn't want to throw it into the skillet just like this, because it's not going to get all of the juices and the flavor out. So I'm just going to give it a quick crush, my mortar and pestle here, get all those juices out, make it so it'll be a little more evenly distributed. And I will add that. And you can see, like, well, that's pretty dark. I'll put it on here. It's still, you can still see it's kind of all still together. It's just stringy, but I got a lot of the juices out. I'm going to add that in here. And then also it calls for pepper. This is to taste. So if you're making this for you for dinner and you like it really hot, again, because we're blending it and those seeds are going to be blended up, the oils from the chilies are going to be blended up, it can be easy if you're somebody who's used to maybe having spice or chili that's chopped up in a stir fry or maybe in Thai food. This is going to be a little bit more pervasive in every bite, and you are going to be breaking up those seeds and that oil. So I would say start smaller than maybe you're used to and work your way up. Instead of getting fresh chilies, because I know that for where I am right now, I know that those would have been shipped in pretty far and they would have come on a long journey. I got dried, dehydrated jalapenos. Dried is a great, spicy. That's a great alternative because one, if you dried your own, when you make an abundance of peppers in your garden, that always works out great. But two, this is so lightweight that and I got it at a bulk store. So that worked out really well too. So I know I'm not going to have as much waste. I got to bring my own container and it's so much lighter and we don't have to worry about it perishing along the way or any of them being like a little bruised or a little ugly. So the grocery store throws those out. So I'm going to use a teaspoon of peppers for that. If we're cooking for sharing with volunteers or to give to the shelter, I would go very light on this just because some folks might not be able to handle the heat and we don't want them to have to see this delicious dish and not be able to partake in it. So, and you can always add more in later if you want. This is one of those dishes like a really good stew that enhances the flavor as it goes. So if you taste it a couple hours from now and you feel like it doesn't have enough spice, you can always put in more and put it in the fridge. And that's going to unlock that flavor afterwards. So you can always take more spice and add it. It's hard to take it out. But if you did put in too much spice, you're going to want to either do coconut milk. You can add a little bit of coconut milk and a little bit of lemon or lime juice, and that'll help cut the spice in that. You can also add in a little bit of sugar. Sugar can cut the spice on that. But I think the coconut milk would be your best bet because it would very naturally just kind of add to the curry flavor and texture. And that does a really good job because the coconut adds to that texture and flavor, but then it feels very natural and then it kind of soothes your tongue if you've gotten too much spice. So I'm gonna let this cook for just a minute more and then I'm gonna get my spinach out so I can flash cook it. One thing I really like about this recipe too is how it reuses the water. And I think that's something that recipes don't often utilize. So I'm gonna take my spinach and put it in my pot with boiling water. I've had it sitting here boiling ready for me. And you don't have to be too concerned about how long you cook this because again, we're gonna put it in the blender. You don't wanna overcook it though because overcooked spinach will get a bitter taste to it. So I wouldn't, put this on the stove and then walk off and watch your favorite show or go chase the dog and start playing with it because while it's okay if it gets a little mushy, sometimes I'm sure anyone who's cooked with spinach knows it feels like you blink and then it turns into a tablespoon of mush. That's fine if it's mushy because we're making a sauce out of it. But we don't want the oils and the chemicals that live inside of the leaves getting overactivated by the heat and then it'll create kind of a bitter on the back of the tongue flavor. So we're looking to avoid that. Oh, and also I forgot to put in my garlic, which works out because you want to put your garlic in relatively at the end. Garlic is also something that if you overcook, it burns faster than everything else that I've put on the skillet. So it cooks better at a lower heat or just very quickly. It also can turn bitter if you overcook it. I did have a couple of bulbs of garlic, but I also, again, I went to the bulk store. I got some dried garlic granules. These are great because, again, if I don't have anything that I'm planning on using garlic later for, I'm not trying to worry about cutting open some of this garlic. This will last for years and years. Actually, I use a lot of garlic, so this was full 6 months ago, but I just keep it here to throw in, add some flavor. So in a pinch, if you don't have a fresh bulb of garlic or some fresh cloves, I would suggest, for footprint's sake, using this instead of using one of the pastes that you can find. But if you're cooking for a ton of people and you don't want to have to be chopping up a million cloves of garlic, this is also a great opportunity to kind of minimize that. So let's see if I can show you my spinach here without steaming it up. So you can see it's still bright green. Leaves at the top are just starting to wilt. I'm gonna cook this for just a little bit longer. We don't want the sauce to have a pesto texture, so we do want to make sure that the spinach itself is cooked and isn't just lightly dark green. But I will also show you how our onions and tomato are doing here. So you can see they're cooking up really nicely. We've got the flavors in there. My peppers have gotten really nice and soft and started cooking in. So far, we're making everything that's gonna become the sauce. And then as soon as we're done, we can take this skillet and we can take the water that we're working with and we can turn that into the rest of the dish. So once the spinach is done, which it's looking like it's gonna be done in just a second, I used my blender for this. You can also use a food processor. Either one works. It just depends on what size you're making and also on what texture you're looking for. Ashwin, do you have any input on like the texture that you like to look for when you're making this?
No, I think it's just personal preference on this one. Because I looked at the dish that you had, the way your spinach looked and the way mine looked, I was like, it's pretty different the way the two of us did it. Yeah, I grind it to a complete paste. Like I shouldn't see even little bit of
any chunks.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is a preference, and it also, if you only have a blender, don't worry about it. I was worried that it would not chop everything evenly, and it seemed to do a pretty good job. So it just is depending on what you have and also depending on what your preference is. So I'm gonna go ahead and put this in here. And then I'm using a slotted spoon. So I'm gonna take my spinach, which now has, you know, the traditional cooked spinach look. It's not, I can smell, it smells like I've microwaved frozen spinach. I think if I had cooked it much longer, since I had it at a soft simmer, I think it would have started to get bitter. If you have it at a rolling boil, it would obviously take less time. But, so I'm gonna go ahead and use my slotted spoon, and I'll just use that so that way we'll still have water left over in the pot. We're going to use that for our potatoes next. And don't worry if you don't have to shake off every single bit of water because you're making the sauce anyway, so you don't have to worry if you get a little bit of water. And you also don't have to be too stressed out if you leave like 1 or 2 leaves in there because it's going to end up in the skillet anyway. You just don't want to have too much in there because otherwise it is going to add a bitter taste to your potatoes. So I'm going to put my pot back on the stove. I'm going to bring it back up to a boil, which won't take very long. I've already spent so much energy heating that water. So instead of pouring that down the drain and starting over and wasting that water, I'm now going to be able to use it for my potatoes. So I've got my spinach, I've got my stuff that I had in here. I'm gonna add in my dried garlic. I'm gonna go ahead and blend this. So it works out great because there's so much moisture in that spinach and in the tomato and the onion that you don't have to worry about it. Woo, hot. You don't have to worry about it getting stuck. I didn't even have to use the attachment to kind of tamp stuff down. So I'm going to pour this in a jar so you can see the texture of what we're looking at here. Let's see here. I'll just pour it in a glass. So it almost looks like a green smoothie. Ashwin called this a curry in his recipe notes. And so I found that when I tasted this fresh, the flavors haven't had time to really unlock right now. So you're not going to have the most flavorful experience with this. This, again, is just like one of those, like a creamy broccoli soup or anything that you make that has that good amount of spices and herbs that are in the background as you start. And then as they have more time, they're going to unlock. So I'm going to set this aside. In my skillet here, I'm going to put a little bit more oil. My skillet's nice and warm still. All the energy that I took to invest in heating it up still going. My water is boiling. Now, I did deviate from Ashwin's recipe on this just a little bit. This is just a preference thing. If you are somebody who likes a little bit of texture to any root vegetables that you are boiling, broiling, or frying, you can add a little bit of baking soda to your water. So like, for instance, if you want a good crisp potato for like a brunch or something like that, and you want that exterior to be really nice and crisp, you're gonna salt the water, and then once it's boiling, you're gonna add about a teaspoon of baking soda. Then you put your potatoes in, and we're cooking them super quickly. We're not cooking them until they're a boil or anything. I'm actually using sweet potato because sweet potato cooks so much faster than traditional potato. So you just add a little bit in there, and then when we put it into the skillet, it's gonna have a little bit of that crisp texture on it. It's not gonna make or break the dish. If you don't do it, it's just a preference thing. The dish is so flavorful, and you've got the tofu and everything else like that. So you're not gonna be like, oh my goodness, someone didn't crisp the potatoes. Just a preference thing on my end. So I've got my water still boiling from the spinach. I'm gonna add my baking soda. When you do that, it fizzes up like a science experiment, like when you made the volcano with vinegar. And I'm gonna go ahead and add in my potatoes. Now it said chop large. This is about what I did for how much of the texture, and wanted it to match relatively the same as my tofu. I didn't want it to be too large because I don't want to worry about it not getting cooked all the way through, but I also don't want it to be too fine because then it'll all feel like one big puddle of ingredients. So I'll go ahead and add my potatoes. And then they can just boil. I'm only going to boil them for maybe 2 to 3 minutes. Again, sweet potatoes cook so quickly. And man, just like spinach, like you blink and you have this firm potato, and then it's in the water, and then you pierce it and it's turned into mashed potato. So they kind of remind me of like the bananas or avocados of potato. Like they're done really, really quickly. So they'll just continue to boil for just a little bit. Over here on the skillet, I've got finely chopped onions here. This is the other half of the onions that we set aside. So I did these more finely chopped. This might be a little bit more diced than maybe Ashwin uses in your recipe on a regular basis. And then I'm going to talk about the tofu while the potato is cooking. So there's a couple of different steps that we're going to want to do for the tofu. I'm fortunate enough that at the Asian market here, they sell pressed tofu. So it saves me an awful lot of time. For folks who are used to working with tofu, you can get a couple of different kinds. Let me show you one of the other kinds that's not pre-pressed. So a lot of times you'll see tofu that comes in this kind of package. It's surrounded kind of in this little tub of water. And when you've got that, when we're buying tofu, we're gonna wanna make sure that we're getting firm or extra firm. If we were to get anything less than that, it's gonna break down. And you'd probably end up with something that's a little bit closer to the American cottage cheese texture. It can be really hard to even pierce with a fork. It's like I don't wanna say it's like a firm Jell-O because it doesn't have the creepy texture of Jell-O, but it definitely, you could mash it with your fork if you get medium. So you want firm or extra firm. But it's living in this tub of water, and if you don't use all of your tofu, you always want to store it in water. Again, you can just use normal tap water, keep it covered, keep it in water. But if you go to an Asian market, chances are good that you will find pressed tofu, and that's what you're going to do if you get the tofu that lives in water. This tofu it has already been pressed, so you can see it, like it's very meaty. It's very meaty in texture. So let me break it open. So Ashwin's like, yeah. So Ashwin and I are both familiar with the struggles and frustrations of pressing tofu because it's very time consuming. But if you get the kind that lives in a package, what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna cut it open, you're gonna drain it, and then you're gonna wanna use like a nice rag, something that doesn't have a lot of fibers that's gonna get stuck to the tofu. I like to cut it in about thirds. It doesn't matter long ways or lengthways. And then you want to cover it with another towel. You want to put like a cutting board and a heavy book. Go get that encyclopedia that you never use anymore, something like that. You don't want it to be too much weight. Like don't go to your weight set or anything because that's just going to smash your tofu. But you are going to want to press it. And the longer you can press it, the more flavor it's going to absorb. So, Ashwin, how long do you press your tofu for? Do you do this overnight?
Yeah, I start it early in the morning and I use it maybe in the evening straight away. Yeah.
Yeah. So, in a perfect world, yeah, you're gonna want to press it for a pretty good amount, especially again because we want this tofu to absorb the flavor of the sauce that we've made, and it has a lot of flavors that are all complementing each other. So this isn't one big loud Dorito flavor sauce. This has a lot of subtle sauce flavors to it. So if it's not absorbing it, you're gonna have a bite of tofu surrounded in sauce. So we wanna press it. In a pinch, I would say you can press it for an hour, especially like if you've cut it in thirds, that's helping absorb more of it. But in a perfect world, if you're someone who has all of their life together as much as Ashwin does, that you can wake up early, get at your tofu processing happening before work, that's great. Or again, you're gonna wanna head to the Asian market. So once your tofu is pressed, then you can go ahead and cut it in these cubes. And so I'm gonna go ahead and my potatoes have been boiling. I've got my pressed tofu here. So I'm gonna go ahead and take the potatoes. They're getting all nice and foamy. And I'm gonna test them with a fork here. And you want to be able to just pierce it. So you can see, like, it's not mushy all the way through. I just dropped it in the sink. You don't want to be able to just puncture all of them. You should be able to still feel that they're pretty firm. These are perfectly done. So I'm going to take my slotted spoon and I'm going to hold it over this. We don't want to be too generous with the water in this situation. Oil and water are not friends. So I'm going to go ahead and put these potatoes in. And if you need to, you can use a strainer for this. My laptop is sitting over my sink, so I'm going to be extra careful, and I'm not going to strain splashy hot liquids next to my computer. But we're done with this water now. If you don't put baking soda in it, I really like taking this water, and once it has cooled down and is tepid, I like to put it onto my outside plants. There's a lot of nutrients in it. And so if it doesn't have baking soda in it, I really like doing that. So I've got my potatoes here. I'm gonna hold them up here just so you can see. Spacing is really important. We don't want the potatoes to all be clumped together. We want to make sure that they all kind of have their own little neighborhood that they can live in. And I'm going to let these guys cook for probably about just 60 seconds or so before I add the onion. I chop the onion so fine that I know it's going to cook really quickly. I also know it's going to release juices into this, which is going to stop the crisping of the potato. It's really hard for things to crisp up if they're sitting in a small puddle of onion juice. So if you're looking to get that crisp potato, let these guys just kind of cook on their own, and you can roll your potatoes over and kind of check on them and see how they're going. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about with this baking soda here. So this is what the potato looks like. It almost has like a French toast look to it because of that baking soda. If we hadn't put the baking soda on it, then you would just get a cooked potato. And it certainly will brown, but it doesn't create a crisp exterior on it. So I'm just gonna make sure that everything's kind of browning evenly, flip over my potatoes. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add my onion and my tofu now, because I've got that nice, show you another potato here. I've got a nice crisp exterior happening on my potatoes. This is another one here. So this works great too. If you toss them in the oil and you put them in the oven at a really high temperature, you're gonna get that really nice crisp breakfast potato. So I'll go ahead, toss in the onion. And toss in my tofu. Let this all kind of get cooking. And because tofu, for folks who are new with cooking with tofu, it doesn't really require a lot of heavy cooking. It cooks pretty quickly, especially if you're gonna sit it in a simmer or a sauce with something else. You could eat it the way that it came in the package. I think if you did, you would find that it is quite flavorless, and you would probably end up making the same face of everyone who has never eaten tofu and who thinks that's what vegans eat all day long, and they would be like, ugh, this tastes like absolutely nothing. But that's the beauty of tofu, is that it's very versatile and that it can absorb any of the flavors that you pair with it. You know, you can even just cook it up in like a nice butter and olive oil mix with some herbs, and then it tastes like something that's been cooked in butter and herbs, which everything that tastes like, everything that has that happen to it is delicious. So I'm gonna go ahead and give this just a quick stir again. My sweet potatoes are pretty much ready already, just because again, sweet potatoes cook so quickly. The onions are cooking quickly because I cooked them up, or I chopped them up so small. And then in a minute, we're gonna add our curry sauce. Ashwin, do you have anything to add? Any steps that I'm forgetting, or any tips that you feel like are really important to remember for this?
No, I think it's good. Yeah.
And then we had talked about what we would pair with this. Obviously, putting this on rice. I don't know. I didn't get a chance to look up to see if brown rice or white rice has any difference as far as environmental impacts. I'm not sure if anybody on the call knows anything about if there's a pro or con to that. I also think that if you were to do something like cauliflower rice, that would have a lower impact than if you were doing just a traditional grain. All the better, again, if you buy your own head of cauliflower and you toss that into a food processor in small batches. And then that way, if you chopped it up and you put the whole thing in your food processor, I promise you, you're gonna have like the bottom is gonna be a paste and the top half of it's gonna be chunks, and you're gonna be very sad. So if you were to just chop it up into floret sizes and stalks and then toss it in batches and pulse it, you can make your own cauliflower rice that way. You can blanch it and then fry it. And that would probably go well as well. But if you're serving a lot of people and you just want to be able to make a grain to go with this, again, like I said, barley is really good, or rice. So I'm going to go ahead and add in my sauce with this now. I'll show you what you can see. We don't have to have everything too browned. The point is that my potatoes are soft, my tofu is cooked and heated through, my onions are nice and soft, so someone's not going to feel like they're eating like a salsa mixed in with the curry or anything.
There is one thing maybe. So
Yeah.
I think your spatula is plastic,
Yes.
right? Yeah, that's very, very important because mine is a steel one, and I have to be very careful with the tofu. Else I end like literally splitting it up, or like, because of the weight or the force, it just disintegrates the tofu. Like maybe because you have the plastic one, it
Yeah, that's a really good point. And
much.
I actually think it's more because of the pressed tofu. Like this tofu, I could throw across the room and it would not break. It's like meaty. So like, so I'm able to be pretty rough with it. But you're absolutely right. If I had used the firm tofu, then me just like vigorously stirring it would be breaking it up. That's a very good tip. Thank you. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in the sauce. And I'm gonna turn my skillet down to low right now because we're not trying to fry this in. And give it a nice stir. If you have the tofu that is not hearty, be very careful so you don't end up with tofu blobs instead of tofu cubes. And if I'm remembering right, Ashwin, you don't cook it much past this. We're just like using the heat to kind of let everything absorb and
Correct. Yeah.
sit in it. But we're not like, this is not the second stage of cooking. We're not cooking this like a soup now.
True.
And be mindful too, if you're using, if you have a skillet that isn't a nonstick skillet or isn't like a nicely seasoned cast iron, if you went from medium to low heat, and you just added the sauce, and you're going to want to be carefully continuing to stir it, or otherwise it's going to be searing to the bottom. And then you're going to be losing a lot of the flavor and the sauce that you work so hard to make. And also then it's going to be tough for you to maneuver this around without breaking up the tofu. But so we can just go ahead, turn it off. I'll go ahead and put some of it in a bowl. Now, Ashwin recommends giving this at least 2 hours because I did agree, like when I tasted this fresh and I was like, oh boy, this all looks so good. It looks just like Ashwin's picture. I'm gonna eat it now. It is good. It is absolutely good. I think if you put anything on a steaming pile of fresh rice and you have ginger and garlic and things like that, it's gonna taste good. But it did taste more complex and robust about an hour later. And then I thought, well, surely this is like an hour's fine. And then I tasted it 2 hours later, and then I was like, okay, I taste the difference. And then the next day, it was even better for lunch. So it's the gift that keeps on giving. It rewards you for your patience. If you were in a pinch, you absolutely could eat it now. And I don't think that you would be like frowning the entire time. And maybe if you didn't know how flavorful it becomes, you would be happy with it. But because I wanted to take the time to try for science sake and in patient's sake to sample it throughout the way, it does reward you for waiting. So I'll show you the final product here. And again, just I would put it on with a grain. The other thing that I don't have a lot of flatbread choices here. So one thing that we use that's at the Asian market that works really well too is that we have Scallion Pancakes, which is just like a really fast, thin, I would say it's almost like a pizza dough type texture. And then it's got chopped green onions, which you can see peeking through here. And then you fry those in copious amounts of oil. And then they get nice and fluffy and crisp. And they were really good for dipping in that too, which, surprise, surprise, fried bread is delicious. And it did negate some of the Whole Foods health aspect of this meal, but if you're looking to compensate or compromise that aspect, you can go to your Asian market. If you went to go get the pressed tofu, keep an eye out for a lot of the scallion pancakes. Most all of them are vegan. And so that's a really nice quick bread that you can fry up and add to that. So that is our meal. Does anybody have any questions or tips? I'm gonna see if I made this one too spicy like I did the last one. No, although it's still just that tablespoon of dried stuff goes so much farther. So it still has some heat to it, but I didn't make it too spicy. So now I can mix the two together. I think for folks who are going to be doing this for volunteering, the recipe did not take very long to make at all. It's pretty quick. And then it's pretty easy to store too. Like it didn't take up a lot of space because you can put it in a jar or you can put it in a Tupperware. Linda, did you have a question?
I actually made it last night and I brought it to show.
Yes!
Oops, my fork is in the way there. Yeah,
yes!
I actually did make quite a number of changes to the recipe, partly to just experiment. I have this, well, palak paneer used to be my favorite thing to eat in Indian restaurants. And then now that I'm not eating any animal products, I've tried to make this many times. So, you know, I'm always interested in different recipes for it. I used frozen spinach, and I was wondering if you had a sort of an opinion about that and whether it would be better to use fresh spinach.
Good question. What do you think, Ashwin?
I have never experimented with frozen ones, so yeah, no idea.
I feel like the frozen stuff, I mean, as long it's still getting nice and juicy. You're still did you boil it or did you microwave it?
I did boil it for just 1 minute, you know, and then I actually pressed it, you know, because I have read that spinach has oxalic acid and it's good to discard that cooking water. So that's what I actually did. The other thing, I actually cooked the potatoes in the microwave, and I didn't use any oil in my recipe either. So I think it is a bit different. The other main question that I had was if you wanted to add, I used the canned chilies, and I think that probably makes a terrific difference because I think that it's very, very mild. And I do have jalapeno peppers, but I didn't realize that was something you could use in this dish. I was thinking it was more some other kind of a chili.
I think originally in the one that I overcompensated, I used 2 serranos and 2 Thai chilies, and so I was overly ambitious, and especially I think I was thrown off by the quantity of spinach that I bought, which was foolish of me because we all know a carload of spinach turns into a tablespoon. So I thought like, oh man, I'm going to be making so much of this. And so then, and I'm going to be like cooking the chilies up. And I wasn't thinking, I've never really made a sauce with chilies where I blended it up. And I think that does elevate the intensity of those peppers. What chilies do you use, Ashwin?
So like you mentioned, if I'm going to Safeway or Winco, it's generally the Thai chilies. And then if I go to the Indian Mart, there is a Indian equivalent for those kind of things. But these chilies are like thin and small, not big and fat like one we get in Safeway or something. Yeah,
yeah, the Thai chilies that I got were so small, she couldn't weigh them on the scale at the register because they were so tiny. And so yeah, I think that using canned chilies might also come with more flavor because it's got the sauce that they're in too. But yeah, I can definitely imagine that would make a big difference having the kind that you use.
Yeah, the other thing that I did was I just put in a few spices, which, you know, because there are certain things that I know that I like, you know, so I put in some coriander and some asafoetida, and I actually put in a little bit of curry powder, and yeah, so that kind of, you know, added a little flavor. But yeah, it was interesting, you know, to try some different variations.
Yeah, and I really liked just how it has a pretty Whole Foods approach to it, and I liked how hearty it was. Like, I think it's a really good example of a little bit of it fills you up. And so if you're somebody who has the mentality of thinking like you have to have meat and potatoes to feel full and that vegetables will never really fill you up, having something that's hearty and flavorful that you eat on a scoop of rice and a little bit of it goes a long way. The one thing I want to try with it is I want to see if it freezes well. Do you know, Ashwin, do you put it in the freezer at all?
No.
I want to see if it freezes well. I know stuff with greens don't always freeze the best, but I know spinach is very freezer friendly. So I'm not sure. And I know the texture of tofu changes when you freeze it.
Mhm.
So it might be a little bit different texture wise. But now that I have made it so that I could have the end result to show, and then I've made it again so that I could show how to make it, I've got a lot of it around, and I was thinking like, oh, okay, I think maybe if I froze it, that would be nice to take out in like single meals and heat up. So I will report back and see how it handles that. I think also my partner put coconut milk in theirs, which I think added a different depth of flavor to it. But I also think like you have to be careful when you're using coconut milk because it can knock out flavor too. So you can like work really hard to have the perfect balance of flavor, and then you add any kind of cashew milk or coconut milk or anything like that, and then it just absorbs it, which is what it's doing to the spice. So if one didn't want to eat a dish that somebody had made too spicy and they didn't want to sit and sweat, then the coconut milk does a great job. The next day after it had coconut milk in it, the flavor came back. But immediately adding in the coconut milk and stirring it up, it mostly tasted like coconut milk with like a little bit of seasoning. And so I think if you're adding coconut milk, I would definitely anticipate waiting a day for everything to kind of unlock and relax a little bit. And then I added in a little bit of lemon juice because I wanted to the lemon juice is really nice at accenting and kind of breaking down the strong coconut flavor. I think if you're somebody who's trying to be mindful about footprints, coconut milk isn't the best for that. And if that was the situation, I would probably recommend using oat milk and just put in a little splash of that. And if you don't have oat milk, you can always make it with your own. If you have a blender and some oats and some water, so you can make your own oat cream or oat milk with that too, if you're trying to minimize your footprint. How did you like the process for making it, Linda?
Well, I tend to be an extremely messy cook, so I made quite a mess of my kitchen. Fortunately, my husband helped. He actually did the cleanup, so that was good. But otherwise, the cooking itself was fine.
I liked. I am also. I'm the kind of person who uses. I'm the kind of person who uses like 50 spoons and 50 forks, and I'm a messy cook as well. And so I really like that this used one skillet and one pot. So that way I didn't have 5 skillets and 2 pots to kind of wade through and have to soak and fight the dishes. And again, that's water consumption, right? So if I am somebody who's mindful of my water consumption and I'm not making it so that I have a sink and a half of dirty dishes, then that's a win. Isn't that right, Scarlett? I have a fussy cat that's upset that it's dinner time. And she's like, I don't eat this. What am I going to do with this? Anybody else have any other questions or information for the volunteering? The donation for the meals going to transitions, that is on the 12th. Am I remembering that?
Yes, that is correct. Yep.
And I felt like between prep and cooking, it took me, when I made it, when I wasn't explaining things step by step and I made it for the very first time, it took me about 40 minutes to chop everything up, cook it, and everything like that. So it's not the most time intensive and it wasn't labor intensive. It was kind of just adding things in,
Procedure, right?
Yeah, it's easy to kind of like coast. So it's not one of those dishes like a souffle or something where you're really worried about it and you have to keep checking on it. So, so that's happening on the 12th. Who should people contact if they have questions with that?
So if anyone has any questions, you can reach out to me and I'll drop my email in the chat.
Perfect. And I will go ahead and drop the recipe in the chat as well. Let me just figure out where we hit it. Here we go.
Linda, have you tried tasting it at different times? Like tasting your dish like a day later or
Well,
seeing how the
I was tasting it today to see if it was different, but I didn't warm it up yet, so I think that might make a difference. You know, it's still cold. Yeah, it might have a little more flavor. Yeah, I think that for my own taste, because I don't like hot. You know, I don't like hot, but I love spicy. If that, yeah,
right,
I like the spices that are not hot. And so I think that is one of the things I really want to experiment more with, is to you know, to figure out, especially with the no oil cooking, you know, because that's what I'm really trying to follow. That is very challenging. So I'm working on, you know, learning more about that.
I do think that this recipe, and Linda, you would be a better judge of it since you did make it oil-free. I feel like this recipe lends itself to being pretty malleable for being oil-free.
Yeah, I did end up putting about a half cup of soy milk in it because it just was too thick. So that, I think that's another thing that even now it's still, it's not really like a sauce. It's more like just kind of globs of spinach, really, you know. So I think it's still, I still need to figure out, you know, maybe the proportion of spinach to water. But the thing that I was kind of, my husband is actually kind of becoming the potato expert in the family, because he, yeah, he said just to microwave them, and he took care of doing the potatoes, and I thought they turned out really well, just 5 minutes in the microwave, and that was it. So that, I think that was the best part, was learning how well that worked.
That's so low fuss.
Yeah.
And again, I think it's a forgiving recipe because there's nothing that is the single star of the dish. I think the sauce carries the potatoes and the onion, and the everything that we put into the sauce obviously is important, but I don't think you have to worry about, if you mess this one thing up, everything else kind of falls flat. So I like it because it feels very versatile. You can make it your own. It's kind of jazz. And so if you're somebody who wants to have it really creamy, you can make it really creamy. If you want it to have more, like you said, cumin and coriander and stuff like that, you can. So it's kind of customizable in that way. So if you were making something for a big group of people, you could make this and then have little seasoned dishes out for people to kind of add what they want to it. And I feel like that's great. How often do you find something where everyone can, you know, I like it really spicy. I like zero spice. I want it to be super flavorful, but I don't want any spice. Like, it's very malleable.
You know, one thing that I was just realizing was that I didn't use any tomatoes. So I think that certainly affected the color, but also the liquid portion. So it's funny that I hadn't thought of that before, but I think that made a difference. The other thing about the demo, well, first of all, you made everything look so easy. I really enjoyed watching you cook. You know, you just have a real ease about it. But I had never heard of that pre-pressed tofu before. So, you know, that was a new thing for me, because I put my cutting board on this, you know, so it drains into the sink, and I put a plate, and then I put a cast iron skillet upside down on top of the plate, and that seems to do the job. I mean, the tofu turned out fine, but yeah, pre-pressed, that's interesting.
Yeah. Ashwin was telling me all of the fun obstacles of, I think during the summer you were using watermelon to do the pressing.
Oh yeah.
Watermelon.
Yeah.
You use what you have on hands. But yeah, the pre-pressed tofu is a real time saver, and I haven't seen it anywhere else except at Asian markets. And so I'm so spoiled by it now that
I know.
when I
I'm definitely trying it. Yeah.
when I
I'm
saw
definitely.
the ingredients listed, it was talking about like, okay, and then make sure you do the whole pressing rotate. And I was like, oh yeah, pressing tofu. I forgot all about that. And this tofu might hold up to the boiling that you were talking about, Ashwin. We had talked about, where did you hear that maybe boiling it was the same as
Right. You boil it in salt water for 15 minutes or something like that. Yeah.
pull out the water, but Ashwin's
Mm.
scientific discovery showed us that is not, that's an urban
It
legend.
work well. Yeah.
But I mean, you don't need to boil this tofu because it really is so meaty and so dense. But and thank you for the praise, Linda. That means a lot to me coming from someone who does cooking demos quite a bit. So you know your way around the kitchen, and especially someone else who's a messy cook, because yes, I definitely my poor husband and I have had to come up with like, I'm the one that cooks, but also I can't be like, I cook so you clean up, because when my husband cooks, he makes 1/18 of the mess, and so the labor balance isn't exactly equal. So I just like jazz, you know. I just like, I gotta go. Stir this, put this over there. Okay, dash of this. All right, leave that mess over there. We'll get to it later. So, well, thank you everybody, and also thank you to the folks who are watching us to do the food prep for transitions. What a wonderful organization to be helping, especially in this time. And thank you to Amy and to Ashwin and everyone who put this together. And if anybody has any questions, Ashwin has added their email, Symphony Ashwin, that's SYMPHONY ASHIWN92@gmail.com. Is it supposed to be spelled
Oh,
like that?
yeah. No, hang on. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. I was like, what's happening? Okay.
Symphony Ashwin,
Yeah.
ASHWIN92@gmail. And then if you have any other questions for Northwest Veg, you can always email me, Danielle, DANIELLE, @nwveg.org. All right. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.